While he was at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat with Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees saw this and said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" He heard this and said, "Those who are well do not need a physician, but the sick do. Go and learn the meaning of the words, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice.' I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." There's a reason why people get confused by the Bible. It's because the Bible is confusing. There is a reason why the most educated people of every century have had such strongly opposed views on the Christian scriptures over the millennia. It's because scripture is fundamentally a very complicated thing. Anyone claiming that the Bible as a whole is simple and cohesive has not taken it entirely seriously. It's complex, it's nuanced, it's nebulous, it's mysterious, it can be downright convoluted, it can be totally bizarre. The Bible is very, very rarely ever so clear that there is absolutely zero room for different interpretations. You may be able to read the Bible from cover to cover. You may even memorize every passage down to the very last verse. But just because you know Scripture doesn't mean you understand it. The Pharisees in Matthew's Gospel knew their Scriptures very well. These are well-educated Jewish scholars of the law and the prophets. When Jesus told them to learn the meaning of "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," they didn't need to be told that he was referencing the prophet Hosea. They probably could have opened right to the passage if they had their scrolls on hand. Jesus is not telling them that they need to brush up on their prophet trivia. He's saying they know the passage, but they have failed to understand it. They know the words, but they have yet to discover the meaning of the words. And the fact that there's a difference between the two shouldn't come as a terrible surprise to anyone. I'm sure you can think of something you know but don't actually understand. Everyone knows that magnets attract and repel each other, but most people couldn't explain the actual science behind it. Admittedly, Scripture is rarely reducible to the scientific, so we can go a step further. Developing a deeper understanding of Scripture is a lot like developing a deeper relationship with another person. People are amazing creatures, and they are also amazingly complex. You can learn all that there is to know about their ways in a month, and yet, after 100 years, they can still surprise you. You can know about a person in a matter of minutes, but understanding a person takes a lifetime. It's never something you finish. You gain more and more understanding as time goes on. No one should ever believe they have reached a point in a relationship where they understand everything about someone else. They may know a tremendous amount about them, but people are alive, and there will always be something more to discover. So it should go with Scripture. The Word is alive, and there will always be something more to discover. So while we will never understand everything about another person or about Scripture, there are certainly many things we can understand. And how do we learn these things? By asking questions. Now, questioning Scripture is understood by a great many people to be an act of faithlessness. You do not question Scripture. Just read and believe. That's it. That's all you have to do. To this I would say, imagine trying to know someone without ever asking them any questions about themselves. All you could get would be a superficial, surface layer understanding of them, based overwhelmingly on your interpretation of them. Questions aren't necessarily about doubts, although they can be. Questions, first and foremost, are about curiosity. They show that you want to learn more about something or someone. You want to get to know them better. Now imagine a deeper, more intense relationship, say between spouses. Imagine questions not being allowed here. Now it's downright dangerous. Not allowing questions doesn't usually mean you just totally trust someone. It means you don't want to be questioned. The need to know and be known is now subservient to the protection of the ego. This builds the relationship around power dynamics and secrets. It punishes communication, thwarts discovery, and crucially, kills curiosity. It's a tyrant who forbids questions, not a lover. In my opinion, that is an unhealthy relationship with a person, with Scripture, and with God. On this channel, we will be questioning Scripture. And since we want to know Scripture intimately, we will be questioning it all the way down. Not because we think we can best it, not because we're trying to stump it, but because we are curious, because we are confident that we will find answers, and because we truly want to learn the meaning of the words. Now we just need to figure out what questions to ask. I think a good place to start is with the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why. Why is the hardest to answer, and in many ways it's the least informative. We can try to figure out the circumstances in which something was written, but we can only ever guess as to why something was written. As a rule, though, there is one unifying factor to keep in mind. All of the scriptures were written at a time when literacy was not the nigh universal thing it is today. Many people did not learn to read past an elementary school level, if they learned to read at all, not because they were dumb, but because they hardly needed to. Most women maintained a household, most men learned a trade, neither of which required more than the most rudimentary literacy skills. Reading involved formal education, which was uncommon. Writing utensils like parchment and ink were expensive, and the codex, the modern form of the book, was cutting-edge technology at the turn of the 1st century AD. Books are so common today that we don't think much about them, but you can thank the 1400s and the printing press for that. The earliest copies of the Bible are from the 300s and 400s. They were written by hand on sheets of vellum or animal skin, requiring the hides of some 350 calves and or sheep just to produce enough pages. A single volume took years to complete and would have been worth more than your average house. Reading and writing was for scribes and scholars. That was literally their job. If you were going to write something down, you better have a good reason to be spending these precious resources. So, when it comes to why the scriptures were written, this is our answer. The authors believed deeply that what they had to say was worth writing down. Having established that, I will not be dwelling any more on why, because we have much bigger fish to fry. Starting with what. What exactly is the Bible? I mean, seriously, what is it? Why have so many billions of people for so many thousands of years been making such a big fuss about this one little book? Well, actually, that's our first mistake. The Bible is not a book. I mean, yes, it's a bunch of pages with words on them between two covers, but calling the Bible a book is actually very, very misleading. Let's take a second and learn the meaning of the word for the word. Bible is a sort of made-up word in English, used to copy the Latin word for the Christian scriptures, Biblia. Funnily enough, though, the word Biblia is also a sort of made-up word in Latin, used to copy the Greek word that was used to refer to the Hebrew scriptures, Biblia. This word means scrolls, or if you like, books. But notice, Biblia is plural. The singular would have been biblion. The Bible is not a book. It's a library. It is, and always has been, many books. How many books depends on who you ask. The Bible is split into two very unequal halves. The much smaller New Testament was written in AD and documents the life of Jesus and the early Christian communities. Contrary to popular belief, there was no set list from heaven telling us which books were supposed to be included in the New Testament. Scholars and theologians discussed, disputed, and debated the matter for centuries. Today, virtually all modern Christians agree on the same list of 27 New Testament books. The much larger Old Testament is actually only Christian by adoption. These are actually the Jewish scriptures, written by the Hebrew people for the Hebrew people. They were all written before Jesus ever began his ministry. Jesus was Jewish, and so were a significant majority of his followers. They understood Jesus to be the fulfillment of their scriptures. So, even after Christianity came to be seen as more and more distinct from Judaism, the early Christians appropriated the Jewish texts into their library of scriptures. Now, again, there was no magic list telling the Jews which books were scripture. During the time of Jesus, there was significant active debate over what the Jewish scriptures were. In fact, it was one of the major issues that divided Judaism between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The conservative Sadducees claimed that the only books of scripture were the Torah, which Christians will recognize as the first 5 books of scripture: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That was it. That was the whole thing. The more liberal Pharisees, on the other hand, began to include a much broader selection of Jewish literature. Many highly esteemed Hebrew texts had been translated into Greek over the past few centuries, and a great many of the texts that had been selected for translation were being recognized by the Pharisees as scripture. After the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in the year 70 AD, the Sadduceic school died out, making the broader Pharisaic approach to scripture more mainstream. So, when it came time for Christians to decide what to include in their library, not everyone reached the same conclusions. Protestant Christians, who make up about a third of the world's Christian population, strictly recognize the books that were included in the Hebrew Masoretic text in Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Jews count 24 books in their library, called the Tanakh, but Christians split many of these books up, for a total of 39, bringing the Protestant Bible to a clean 66 books. Catholic and Orthodox Christians, who make up most of the other 2/3 of Christendom, include another 6 books from the early Greek translations of Jewish literature, bringing their library up to 72 books. And finally, Catholics, who make up about half of the Christian world on their own, add on 1 more book for a grand total of 73. Which brings us to where, when, and who. Where did all these books come from? When were they written? And who wrote them anyway? The books of the Bible were written within a relatively small area of the world. Almost none of the books say where they were written, but it's fairly safe to say that all of them were written within 1,000 miles of the Mediterranean Sea, and most of them were written within 100. Determining the time and authorship of a given text can get far more contentious. For a great many people, the authenticity of a text relies on the authenticity of its author. Only about half of the books in the Bible make any sort of mention of their authors. Some books name multiple authors, some of them use pseudonyms or pen names, but by volume, most of the Bible is anonymous, most notably the entire Torah and all of the Gospels. The author wasn't mentioned because the author wasn't important. At the time, the content of the text was what mattered most, not who wrote it. The determination to attach authors to Scripture is a byproduct of Greek culture and literature. From the last centuries BC to the first centuries AD, Jewish culture had been greatly influenced by Greek culture. Greeks put great stock in recognizing the authors of their poetry and philosophy, like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, names we still recognize today. The greatness of a text was largely attributed to the greatness of its author. It's not just the Republic, it's Plato's Republic. And Plato matters because he's the student of Socrates, and Aristotle matters because he's the student of Plato, and so on and so forth. It is in this environing culture that Judaism began to develop traditions of authorship for their sacred literature, not all of which fit very well into timelines provided by the rest of world history. The very oldest pieces of scripture may go back as far as the 1100s BC, and the youngest may be as late as 125 AD, meaning the books of the Bible were written over the course of over 1,200 years. To put that in perspective, 1,200 years ago from today was the 800s, when the Chinese invented gunpowder, the Muslims invented algebra, and Alfred the Great became the first king of England. Okay, so why does any of this matter? Why is any of this important? Does anyone need to know these things if they just want to read the Bible? Just read? No, you don't. To read the Bible, all you need is a copy to read and 2 eyes to read with. But if you want to understand it, to learn the meaning of the words, yes, I would argue. I think it's absolutely essential. First of all, this dispels the illusion that there is one authentic version of the Bible. Different groups have always made different claims as to which texts qualify as scripture. The earliest Bibles we have do not include the same books, and there are inconsistencies and discrepancies even within the books themselves. The development of the Christian canon was not simple and clean. It was complicated and messy, which is how there are still differences in the canons today. Furthermore, as there is no singular authentic version of Scripture, there is no singular authentic translation of Scripture. The Bible was not written in English. Not a single word. English, as we know it, did not exist when the Scriptures were being written. For that matter, the Bible was not written in Spanish, Italian, German, Arabic, Russian, Japanese, Zulu. The Bible wasn't even written in Latin. The Old Testament was written in ancient Hebrew. The New Testament was written in ancient Greek, with both having a few passages written in ancient Aramaic. And for the record, while we do have some very old manuscripts, we don't have any originals, which means everything is a copy. Everything not in the original language is a translation, and there is no such thing as a perfect translation. Every translation is necessarily an interpretation. This is why caution must be taken when putting too much emphasis on the exact wording of a particular passage. It is not so much the words that matter, It is the meaning of the words. Secondly, recognizing the Bible as a collection of books rather than one singular text greatly informs how you should read it. No one would go into a library and try to read every book as if each of them was written by the same person at the same time for the same audience and in the same genre. No one would take you seriously if you tried to explain the Declaration of Independence by citing Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat. Now, that is not to say that the books of the Bible have nothing to do with each other. Finally, they are intimately connected by an overarching theme. Each one plays a part, however large or small, in telling the greatest story ever told: humanity's search for God and God's search for humanity. But each book does so differently. Many devotees of the Christian Bible feel a need to read the entire thing as if it was a singular history book. But it isn't. It never has been. Some of it is history, yes. Some of it is biography. Some of it is letters. But some of it is poetry. Some of it is music. Some of it reads like a rule book or instruction manual. Some of it is philosophical, musing on the meaning of life. Some of it is hagiography, a highly stylized form of biography that blends history with teaching. 2 of the books don't even mention God, not even once. And some of it, yes, some of it, is fiction. Now, trying to declare any part of Scripture as being even potentially fictitious is usually met with fierce outrage. How dare you try to say that parts of the Bible are fake or made up? Here's the thing, though. Just because something is made up doesn't mean it isn't true. Consider this. When the stories of Jesus talk about him teaching other people, there is a method they all recognize him using: parables. Parables are not stories of historical persons and events. They're fables. They're made up. But that doesn't mean they aren't true, by which I mean they are about truth. They contain truths. And Jesus seems very intentional about exploring truths in this way, so much so that the Gospels say things like, he spoke to them only in parables, and without parables he did not speak to them. There is no need to defend the historicity of the characters in Jesus' parables. He's making up memorable stories to get his audience to reflect on the big truths he's trying to teach them. Not everything he said was meant to be taken literally. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is quoted as saying, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower." Yet there is nobody trying to argue that Jesus was a plant. That would be ridiculous. Jesus was a man. We can all agree on that. He is obviously using a metaphor, an imaginary image employed to talk about a deeper truth. If the greatest teacher of all time, the literal Son of God, chooses fiction as his primary teaching technique, why should we be so determined to reject its appearance elsewhere in the Bible? If it didn't undermine the validity of Jesus' teaching, why should it undermine the rest of Scripture? Now, this goes both ways. Just because some parts of the Bible are parables and symbols doesn't mean all of it is. Reading the Bible as if the whole thing were a fairy tale is just as foolish as reading the whole thing like a history book. The Bible is a library. Each book should be carefully read with respect to how it was written. It's not always clear at first how a book should be read, which is precisely why it behooves us to take the time to sit with each book and really get to know it. The what, the when, the where, the who. Putting our predispositions and preferences aside so we can accept the book for what it really is, not for what we want it to be. All of this sure makes the Bible feel much more messy and complicated, doesn't it? It'd be so much easier to just read the thing and not worry so much about all of this subtext and context. And that's a fact. Again, it's very much like when you actually get to know someone really well. Things get more complicated. You realize that there was a lot more to them than you once thought. All their hopes and dreams, their feelings, their opinions. Sometimes you might even wish you didn't know so much. Some things you don't know how to react to. Some of it makes you downright uncomfortable. Things were simpler before you got caught up in all their history and baggage. In some ways, it was easier to love them before you knew all this. But that's the thing with love. If you only love someone on the outside, if you love them part way, you don't really love them. You love the thought of them. You love the imaginary version of them that makes you happy. That may be a good start, but it's only a start. To really love someone, to love them the way Jesus challenged us to, you have to go all the way down into their mystery and mess, down into their past and preoccupations, down into their confusions and contradictions. The deeper you are willing to go, the more you are willing to learn, the more you will achieve on the journey to truly know someone. So it goes with Scripture. I believe there is finally no better way than this to learn the meaning of the words.